and we want to remind you that the views and opinions expressed throughout the broadcast day are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, or underwriters. Time will be made available for other viewpoints.
You're a globalized curse. You put war on the masses and then you clean out the purse. And that's how it's done. War after war.
Coming to you live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio, this is Heroes and Patriots. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, April 6, 2023, and we are very glad that you have joined us. I'm Mary Massey, and joining me via Zoom is John SAKOWICZ on the East Coast. Hey, good afternoon, John.
Hey, Mary, it's good to be back on the show. 2 shows in 2 weeks. I want to thank KMUD for engineering the show and all the other great technical support that they provide to us.
Great, and if you could get just a little closer to your mic, that would help our listeners. Today's program will be archived at kmud.org and at our program website, heroespatriots.org, plus all social media. Our engineer today is Dorothy, as mentioned, and she said views and opinions expressed by our speakers are those not necessarily of the board, staff, underwriters, volunteers of KMUD. I want to remind listeners that they can ask questions of our guests. The number to call with a brief question, 707-923-3911. For the next hour, our guest will be Dr. Ian Lustick. Dr. Lustick holds the Bess W. Heyman Chair in the Political Science Department of the University of Pennsylvania. He teaches Middle Eastern politics, comparative politics, and computer modeling, which I think is kind of interesting. Would like to hear more about that. He is a recipient of awards from the Carnegie Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Sciences Research Council, and the United States Institute of Peace. And before becoming to his current position, he taught for 15 years at Dartmouth College and worked 1 year for the Department of State. We now welcome Dr. Ian Lustick. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Mary.
We're very glad to have you. You know, in our last show, we were speaking with Trita Parsi and Richard Silverstein about events that were unfolding in Israel, in and around Israel, I should say, with respect to the reformation of the Supreme Court there. Do you want to give us just an update on where things are with that before we launch into our topic today?
Yes, as with everything having to do with Israel, it seems, which word one uses tells an enormous amount immediately. So if we call it a judicial reform or reformation, we're accepting the language of the government, an extreme right-wing government. If we call it a coup d'etat or a blitzkrieg, we're a judicial overhaul, we're adopting the language of the protesters. So what is this all about? I think many of the viewers would understand that the new government in Israel, which is an unprecedentedly extreme government from the point on the right and reliant on ultra-Orthodox support, has moved exceedingly strongly to do a radical change in Israel, in the status of the Israeli judiciary, the Supreme Court, but actually the entire judiciary, to take away its ability to declare laws that the Knesset passes, the parliament passes, unconstitutional or illegal. There is no formal constitution. Many people, including myself, consider that there is definitely room for rejiggering and respecification of judicial authority and procedures. But what has been proposed was an outrage to so many Israelis that hundreds of thousands took to the street. We had a general strike that existed. Pilots were refusing to fly their airplanes. So the Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is reliant on extreme elements that absolutely insist on this program, was able to defuse the situation very temporarily. What he did was agree that until after Passover, until early May, essentially, beginning April, the new Knesset session, that there will be a pause in the legislative implementation of these new procedures. However, the votes to do it still exist. There haven't been enough defections from the Likud, and in order to get this delay, the prime minister promised one of the most extreme members of his government, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the police commissioner, a former convicted terrorist, that he could have under his authority a 2,000-person National Guard to combat what he considers to be enemies of the state. So this itself is very controversial. It puts a new controversial element on the table. Nobody really knows what this National Guard is supposed to be or what it would be used by. But we're all waiting until the beginning of May to see whether the talks that are going on to find a compromise will bear fruit. Very few people think they will. And in the meantime, demonstrators in their thousands and tens of thousands are continuing to appear in the streets.
So, of course, last week we reported that Netanyahu also fired his defense minister, and yet it seems he's still there.
Well, what does it mean to fire a defense minister? He said he was firing the defense minister, but apparently never sent him formal notice of that fact. Mm-hmm. This was something, as a defense minister, a member of the Likud, a right-wing figure, but someone who respected as a professional and who had criticized the pace and extent of these judicial changes. And on that basis, really, Netanyahu wanted to say that he'd gotten rid of him in order to support those in his government who favored these measures. However, he never sent an official notification to Gallant. So right now, as you may know, Israel has been attacked by 25, 30 rockets from Lebanon. Seems
Lebanon,
like they were fired by Palestinians, not by Hezbollah. But that has created an emergency of a defense emergency, and Gallant is actually involved in the response, in the decision-making about how to respond to this. So it seems more and more clear that he will remain as defense minister. It was his apparent firing that triggered the general strike. And that general strike was quite effective, and it forced Netanyahu to do something to pause at least this process.
Well, you mentioned pilots not wanting to fly. Are there other areas other sectors of Israel's state that are being affected by this protest?
Okay, so if you look at who the protesters are, they're not a cross-section of Israeli society. Israeli society is built by, as many observers of Israel say, by many tribes, culturally coherent groups with a mentality and an approach to life quite distinctive from other groups. Well, three of the tribes that the government is relying on the support of are the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews who wear long earlocks, the men in black coats and so on. The national religious settler movement, Messianic, based in the West Bank, but having large support within Israel itself, and the Mizrahi ethnic group, which is more than an ethnic group. It's the descendants of immigrants from Middle Eastern and North African countries, who are generally speaking not in the higher strata socioeconomically or educationally. All of those groups tend to support very strongly this government. The people in the streets are overwhelmingly Jews of European or American extraction, their ancestors. They are relatively well off, middle class or upper middle class. They live not in the development towns and in the Jerusalem area so much as in Tel Aviv, Haifa, the upper upscale communities along the coast. They are the ones who staff the high-tech industry, who are the economic entrepreneurs. They have a firm hold on the research and educational system at the top and the research universities. They are the folks who we as Americans tend to think of as Israelis because they're like us. They speak English very well. They are not religious, generally speaking. They may have some traditional ties to Judaism, but they really fear and almost hate the ultra-Orthodox, who they see as exploiting them, taxing them, forcing them to go to the army when the ultra-Orthodox and others do not pay their fair share of taxes in this view, don't go to the army, and so on. So those are the people you're seeing in the streets. And that's remarkable because you don't usually see upper middle class people out in the streets shutting down the country. But they are the people who have the capacity to shut down the country because they provide the key medical services, the professional services. They're the only ones who know how to fly the airplanes. In fact, there's a famous incident that occurred, and this is sort of amusing, but your listeners may be interested in it. During the crisis that just occurred, Sarah Netanyahu, who is a very odd person, as everyone would agree, the wife of the prime minister, was upset because the plane that was to take the prime minister and Sarah to Italy for a meeting was not as big as she thought was appropriate. So she wanted a bigger plane, but none of the pilots who were authorized to fly that plane would fly it because they were on strike against anything that Netanyahu, they didn't want to let him get to the airport. So this is the kind of situation you're seeing in Israel today.
Well, that's interesting that they aren't required to go to the military. John, I think John has a question for you, Dr. Lustick.
Yes, thank you, Mary. First of all, I want to wish our listeners happy Passover. And last night at Seder, as we were reading the prayers, there's such an emphasis on Seder prayers on the law and on mercy. And I wonder how is it that Israel got so lost? How did Israel got so lost that it is essentially recreating the Holocaust, but for the Palestinians? Professor, you have an interesting thesis that you call Holocaustia, and it's three distinct Holocaust narratives that have emerged in the course of Israel's history, in which there are distortions and severe limits placed on the ability of Israel and Israel's leaders to exploit or even perceive opportunities for moving towards peace and mutuality with its neighbors based on the Holocaust narrative. Would you explain that, please?
Yes, I would also wish our listeners happy Passover, Chag Sameach. I must say that I do not want to be associated with the view that Israel is visiting upon Palestinians a Holocaust in any way similar to what Jews suffered in Europe. That is not the case, even though I've written extensively on the systematic discrimination against Arabs who are citizens of Israel, not to say the Arabs who are ruled by Israel but are not citizens. In fact, I would say they are one of the tribes in one of the of Israel, Palestinian citizens of the country. There are about 2 million of them. And one of the interesting facts about these protests is those Palestinians have not been included. And I think it's very interesting in a time when the liberal upper middle class seculars are so desperate to stop something, yet they're not quite desperate enough to call upon the Arabs to join their defense of democracy. And we can talk about that later. But first, now to your question, what do I mean by Holocaustia, which is a strange term for many? What in the book Paradigm Lost, which you're referring to, I'm trying to explain how it is that what for now increasing numbers of Israelis, now that it's absolutely impossible to achieve, the two-state solution seems like it was a rational way to extricate Israel from this impossible relationship with the area that it lives in by giving the Palestinian people something that they could minimally accept as independence, as satisfying their national and cultural rights. And that, what I'm arguing, that is no longer possible via negotiations. We are no longer there. So why? What has prevented it? And I go into detail on three things. And one of them is on the political culture change in Israel that occurred as a result of the way the Holocaust was remembered. Nobody is denying the Holocaust whatsoever, but in Israel, there were different ways that Israelis tried to think about what this massive event was. And one of those ways, one of those constructions of the Holocaust has won out and is now the dominant, I would say, hegemonic way that Israeli Jews tend to see the Holocaust. Not as they first saw it, as a kind of object lesson in the correctness of Zionism, that the Zionists were the ones who knew this was coming. It came. The diaspora Jews who were so unsophisticated, they didn't listen to us. They were in a way doomed, but we are not. Everything that the Holocaust proves that we Zionists were right, and it was the Zionists who carried on the revolts in the ghettos, and unfortunately, most Jews didn't follow Zionist protocols, Zionist advice, and they went like sheep to the slaughter. So that was the first way that Israel tended to see the Holocaust, that construction. It was a rejection of the idea that the Holocaust had anything to do with being Jewish. The second way was something that was developed by Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet, the foreign minister, in the early 50s, when they said, well, the Holocaust is an opportunity in the sense that it's just ordinary anti-Semitism, and it occurs all the time. It was particularly vicious. What's unusual about it is the Gentiles feel guilty about it. In the past, the Gentiles have never felt guilty about slaughtering Jews, but they do now. And so that this is the time when we have to get reparations while the Gentiles still feel guilty. And that was the way to remember the Holocaust that surrounded the Israeli government's agreement with the Adenauer government in Germany to get massive reparations, tens of billions of dollars that went to Israel as a result of that agreement, even though that agreement did not involve Germany accepting a moral responsibility for what happened, or even political responsibility. But that's another story. My point about Holocaustia is that another way to remember the Holocaust also developed, one that was made most important, given most strength by the Eichmann trial and by the rise of Menachem Begin in the late 70s to leadership. The Eichmann trial in the 1960s shocked Israelis. Ben-Gurion arranged the Eichmann trial, brought Eichmann, one of the architects of the final solution, to Israel, put him on trial for months. Everything was broadcast. The horrors of the Holocaust were made public in a way that had never occurred in Israel before. And that was done by Ben-Gurion primarily because he was under attack in a complex case having to do with whether or not he and other members of his party had negotiated with the Gestapo to arrange for the escape of certain Jews who were affiliated with their political party. Now, Ben-Gurion was under attack for that, and he wanted, among other things, to highlight his bona fides as an anti-Nazi by nabbing Eichmann. He did not realize that by putting Eichmann on trial, he would traumatize Israelis to the extent that Begin was able to then come along and say, whether you come from North Africa, whether you really were in Europe during the Holocaust and survived, as long as you're a Jew, you are a survivor, you are a Holocaust victim, and you are a target of the future Holocaust, because all Gentiles ultimately are liable to become Nazis. And therefore, a kind of culture of Holocaustia came about, whereby the trauma of remembering it this way has led all Israeli Jews, and most of them, including myself, and I'm not Israeli, to be subject to a kind of thousands of hyperlinks in our minds. So when we hear the word barbed wire, or we see a dog barking, or we see a carbon monoxide in a truck, or we see a chimney, images of the Holocaust come to mind. And what Begin did was use that fact to focus paranoia, fear of anti-Semitism on Palestinians as if they were the new Nazis. And,
right.
And this is the Holocaust I'm talking about, makes it culturally very difficult for Jews to trust or negotiate with people that others call their enemies. It's a miracle in that sense, as many Israelis have been open to negotiation with Arabs have done it. But that is what I mean by Holocaust here.
Professor, I have a follow-up question. If you Google up my name, Sakowicz, Sakowicz, you'll see that one of my direct descendants, a great uncle, is Kazimierz Sakowicz. He was the first to document the mass murder of Jews. It was in Lithuania in 1942, and he was hunted down by the Nazis and killed in Operation Tempest in Poland. And Mary Massey's family, I believe, also was decimated during the Holocaust as well. So you're talking to two radio show hosts of Polish descent, both of whom suffered during the Holocaust. If you will, talk a little bit about the linguistic foundation for the word Holocaust and the word Shoah, and again, how the law, if you were a rabbi, interpreting the Torah and bringing the Torah into this debate, what would you say?
Well, first, my family also was. Half of my family's from Poland, from Lithuania. They were all destroyed. Those who didn't come here, we have. But of course, for our listeners, this is very common for Jews, for Ashkenazic Jews. So there is in Hebrew a word for Holocaust, Shoah. There have been attempts to theologize or make very subtle distinctions between the meaning of the word Holocaust and the meaning of the word Shoah. But my view is that they are fundamentally the same. They are just reference for this massive, unprecedentedly horrific genocidal campaign. And Holocaust now we see capitalized in English. In Hebrew, there is no capitalization, so Shoah is not capitalized. But if you translate it, you use a transliterator, you do see the S capitalized. There's a meaning that has to do with burnt offering, and that goes back to a very early construction in Israel of the Holocaust as perhaps a sacrifice of some sort that was going to usher in the Messianic age or was some kind of punishment from God. And that was is an extremely distasteful way to remember the Holocaust, and it did not gain traction outside of very ultra-Orthodox circles. But so I wouldn't give too much, or at least I wouldn't, I mean, others might, attention to the specific etymological implications of those words. I'm not clear now what you're asking about.
Well, I'm wondering how Zionism emerged.
Oh well, that's a Zionism emerged well before the Holocaust. Zionism emerged in the late 19th century in a specific area of Europe, Eastern Europe primarily. There were some echoes of it in the West. It came out of a very specific crisis for, cycles and cycles through hundreds of years in Europe. Jews had lived through attacks that then led to the expulsion of Jews from an area And then it turned out that the elites in that area needed the Jews to come back, especially the kings and the princes. They needed to borrow money. They needed trusted tax advisors, tax collectors. They needed the skills of the Jews. They would come back. And one of the advantages of having Jews be your moneylenders is that you could kill them and not owe the money to anybody anymore.
Oh.
So Jews through European history would go through cycles of relative prosperity and then destruction. And in Poland in the 17th century, you had several hundred thousand Jews killed in the Kalmaniki rebellion. As an example, when the Tsar Nicholas, when the Russian Tsars in the late 19th century, following an assassination of one Tsar, and one of the people involved was a Jew, there was a crackdown on this area within which millions of Jews were forced to live, called the Palace Settlement. 1/3 of the Jews were to be expelled, 1/3 forcibly converted, and 1/3 killed. And the pressure on this community was enormous. That's why I live here. That's why about 1.5 million Jews left and went to the United States and Britain between 1885 and 1914. But for a small group of Jews, that was not the right solution. It was a time, said those who called themselves Zionists, to stop just running to another place where persecution would hit Jews again, find a place where Jews could be in the majority and they could normalize themselves instead of being a minority everywhere, mysterious and threatening to those around them. Jews would be like everyone else, said the Zionists, a majority somewhere and a minority in other places. Where would that be? The first Zionists didn't even necessarily think it had to be or should be in Palestine. But eventually, if hundreds of thousands of Jews, 1.5 million would go to Britain and France, very few were willing to go, Britain and the United States, very few were willing to go and live a difficult farming life in Palestine. Only the most ideological, the most disciplined, the most committed, the most fanatic, they went to Palestine, and of those, only the most committed and fanatical stayed because it was very difficult. That's where Zionism came from. It grew out of that crisis of European Jewry, especially East European Jewry. But in the West, with the Dreyfus trial in the late 1890s, it shocked many Jews in the West also to think, wow, enlightenment and democracy is not getting rid of anti-Semitism. Instead, in fact, some governments, including the German government, some French governments, are themselves turning against the Jews. And this led to further support for Zionism. But it must be emphasized, as I think you know, that until well into the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of rabbis and Orthodox Jews opposed Zionism as a contradiction of God's will. Because from their point of view, God had said, Jews are living in the diaspora, in exile from the land, for a reason. And when God wants to bring them back, to bring the Messiah, to bring redemption, he'll do that. To do it ourselves, to conquer the land, to do it as a political movement, is to commit the sin of pushing the end, of trying to bring the Messiah before God is ready to do so. So Zionists were considered apikorsim, sinners, by the rabbinical establishment, really until World War II. And then what was left of that establishment has accepted Zionism as a useful but misguided movement. More recently, and we see it clearly in this government, the ultra-Orthodox rabbis have seen it more as perhaps an instrument they can use to make a country in their own image. And that is something that is terrifying the secular middle-class Israelis I was talking about before.
It's 30 minutes past the...
Mary, I wish what Professor Lustick just said I wish you could sit everyone down from the State Department down to hear what Professor Lustick just said. I think that is the germ of this discourse. This is the germ of the debate, the great debate in Israel. I wish we can extract that and post that to our site. That's what this is all about.
Right.
It really is.
It's 31 minutes past the hour. I wanted, excuse me, to catch our breath and reintroduce our guests after the musical interlude. So stay tuned and come back. Hundreds of internet. I started to say he teaches Middle Eastern politics, comparative politics, and computer modeling, which again kind of tickles my interest. He's a recipient of awards from the Carnegie Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Scientists Research Council, and the United States Institute of Peace. Before he came to Pennsylvania, he taught 15 years at Dartmouth College and worked for 1 year at the Department of State. We hadn't mentioned your book, but I do want to mention your book because we've referenced it already. And welcome back to the program, everyone, if you're just tuning in. So you wrote this book, Paradigm Lost, From Two-State Solution to One-State Reality. And it is to analyze the origins and the implications of the disappearance of the two-state solution. Could you expound on that a little bit? Just briefly kind of bring us, what are the kernels there that we need to know?
All right. And your listeners may be interested. I actually went to Berkeley I got my PhD degree at Berkeley. I lived in
well, thank you for telling me that.
In the early 70s. And that's the early 70s. There were about 1,100 settlers in the West Bank.
Wow.
I formed at that time a small organization called Yesh Breira because as a political scientist, I knew that small things when in particular contexts can have huge consequences. And I wrote and argued that by putting any civilian settlers in the West Bank, Israel would be locking itself into a political dungeon from which it would never escape. Because I was a Zionist and I was committed to what I thought would be a nice, cozy little Jewish state that would be also democratic. But that meant not ruling millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I argued that even a few settlers would create the opportunity for the right wing in Israel that always wanted to expand to prevent compromise by saying, look, those leftists want to make the West Bank Judenrein, which is the German word for making something free of Jews. And I said, once the right would have the slogans like that, there would never be able to be a Palestinian state. And so we started a petition campaign in the Bay Area that went all over the world among Jews to protest the establishment of civilian settlements in the West Bank and to call for a Palestinian state living peacefully next to Israel. Well, we were called anti-Semites and attacked right and left at that, which is amusing now because I'm often called an anti-Semite because I no longer support the two-state solution, but I started out being called one because I proposed it. At any rate, I fought for years, decades really, against the argument that it was too late, that already with 20 or 30 or 40,000 settlers, it was too late. And then the settlers themselves said, once we get 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, it'll certainly be too late to have a Palestinian state. There are now over the Green Line about 750,000 settlers. 1 out of every 10 Jews lives over the Green Line. Israel itself has been transformed from a kind of, in American parlance, kind of New Jersey or Connecticut, a blue state. It was like Ohio, maybe purple in the 1980s, sometimes Likud, sometimes Labor. Now it is Oklahoma. It is Idaho. It's in Nebraska. It's deeply red. That's what really, and I give in my book the reasons how it got there, including American aid, unfettered, so much American aid by presidents and Congress who would never say publicly that they disagreed seriously with the Israeli government, allowed the entire Israeli political system, forced it to the right, because every time a politician came up who argued for compromise, because otherwise the world wouldn't let Israel keep all the territories and still be a democracy, that was turned out to be false. The United States caved in every time. And that meant that the most successful politicians were always those who promised everything. We can have the territories. We don't have to give rights to the Arabs. The Americans will give us money. They'll give us weapons, and we don't have to worry about anything. And they kept being right. So American aid unintendedly helped seal the doom of the two-state solution. Now I'm looking at a situation in which there is not a one-state solution. That is, there's no stable, things that picture that anybody's really happy with. What there is a one-state reality. From the river to the sea, there's one government that determines whether your house can be standing tomorrow or not. And that is the government that calls itself Israel. It's a government that sits in Jerusalem. It doesn't matter if you're living in Nahariya, in Tel Aviv, in Gaza City, or in Nablus. That's the government that decides whether your house can stand tomorrow. And that's what I mean by there's one state in the whole country. Now, what the politics of that state, people are still often living with the idea that there will someday be a two-state solution. So there's still a temporary occupation of the West Bank and a temporary control of Gaza with their over 5 million people with no political rights. That's not really sustainable, and it is not the case. It's not temporary. It's permanent. But of course, as we know from the United States and other cases, you can't, in a democracy, keep half the population or more from having any political rights. And when you look at that's the struggle that is beginning in Israel now. No government not run by the Netanyahu bloc can be formed without Arab political parties, Arab votes. That's new. And in the future, it will not be possible, and even now is not possible, to have an actual non-right-wing government unless you start allowing Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to also vote. And in my article, and in my book, I discuss how countries like Israel that are partially democratic because citizenship rights have only been extended to a portion of the population, how that democratization occurs. It takes a long time. It's much harder than just, overthrowing a dictator and flipping from a dictatorship to a democracy, like it happened in Romania or Hungary or Argentina. When you have to extend rights to women or to blacks or to Catholics in Britain or to Arabs, it can take generations of struggle before that kind of change evolves. Israel is actually on a faster track toward that kind of change than I had imagined when I wrote the book. But still, you see that even though it's known that Arabs now must be part of the government, if the government is not going to be right-wing, it's still not allowed, as it were, to include Arabs in mass demonstrations for democracy. Because, and here I'll end my little soliloquy here.
Okay, keep going.
Israel was established as a democracy, a liberal democracy for Jews, not for all its citizens. It was established, though, in a way that a facade of liberal democracy for the outside world would be created. Israel was not, when it applied to be in the UN, it was refused at first because of the way it was treating its Arabs inside the country. It promised to make all kinds of changes, and the UN then accepted it. It didn't really make those changes. There was a gentleman's agreement that even though the security services in a different set of laws effectively under the table would rule Arabs in Israel, that the Jews would have their own democracy. And you wouldn't have to pass explicit laws like apartheid to say so. Now, that gentleman's agreement is breaking down because more and more Jews who are secular and liberal see that their rights are not safe. In fact, they don't have rights that they can use to protect themselves against the ultra-Orthodox or the Messianists or anybody else unless they start allying with Arabs. And that's uncomfortable. But that's the process we're in Israel now.
You said earlier, though, that the Arabs have no way of negotiating, and yet on the other hand, you're saying they need to be a part of the negotiations. How is that going to work out without military efforts? How are they going to get involved?
Okay, so let's take Jerusalem as an example of how this could evolve. And people may not know it. What Israel did in Jerusalem is something very complicated. In 1967, they drew a line around a big chunk of the West Bank, about 70 square kilometers, and said, this is also the city of Yerushalayim. They extended the borders of the city, the Israeli city of Jerusalem, to include this part of the West Bank. It included, at that time, about 70,000 Palestinians. Those Palestinians are now about 330,000.
Right.
But Israel did not make those people citizens of Israel because they didn't really extend the border of the country. They extended the border of the city. So those people are citizens of Jerusalem, but not citizens of Israel. They cannot vote in Knesset elections, but they can vote for the mayor of Jerusalem and for the city council. They have not done so because it was considered to be accepting the permanence of occupation.
Right.
But now the occupation really is permanent, and they are starting to demand citizenship and starting to vote. And their votes could actually determine the outcome of the mayoral election in Jerusalem. And the left is starting to realize that. So now the government of Israel is cracking down, not allowing Jerusalem Arabs to gain citizenship, even if they apply for it. It's very hard to do. But this is the first struggle we may see is in the next municipal elections in Jerusalem to see the way alliances form and how that can produce more political rights for outgroups. Let's talk about women for a minute in Britain or in France or the United States. How did they actually get the right to vote? Not because they took up arms and forced the men, not because they negotiated with the men and the men have said, okay, you can have, we see you're right. We'll compromise and give you some right. No, it wasn't that way at all. They struggled and struggled. And then at a certain point, some men felt that in order to win over other men, they needed to give women rights so that women could vote for them.
Wow.
That's how blacks got, in the United States, got political power also. The Democrats came to need them. That's how change takes place in these kinds of countries. That's how the Arabs in Israel, who are citizens, are starting to have rights to have political parties. That is why this government, once it gets the judicial changes it wants, there's all kinds of legislation it wants to pass that would prevent Arabs from having political power in Israel. It would prevent Arabs from having their own political party if they're not Zionists, for example. You could pass a law that bans non-Zionist parties. That forever would prevent citizenship from being effectively extended to the West Bank and Gaza, even though those areas are considered by this government to be absolutely part of the state of Israel. So lurking behind what seems to be a procedural argument about the role of the Supreme Court and who gets to appoint judges in the Israeli Bar Association, that's not the real issue.
Yeah.
The real issue is no one wants to talk about it. It's, well, whether the 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and the 2 million Palestinians inside of Israel proper, whether that half of the population will have equal rights in the country. And therefore, it won't be a Jewish state in the sense that it will be run by Jews. It will be run by Jews and Arabs. The right wing knows that if it gets what it wants, which is to keep all the territories, and it needs Israel not to be a liberal democracy, not even to be a democracy. It has to be a country where only a certain segment of the population has the political rights. The left, the middle class, the urbanites, the seculars know, although they don't want to say it, that in the long run, their ability to stand before a demographically exploding right wing is that the Arabs have to be emancipated. They're afraid to say that now because they'll be treated as Arab lovers or as people who aren't really interested in the Jewish state. There's some things you can't talk about too early. I use in my article, not the book, but in the article, the example of Abraham Lincoln, who before the Civil War, when he talked about slavery in 1858, talked about the impossibility of the house of the country standing half slave and half free. It would be either entirely a slave country or entirely emancipated. And that's what I'm saying about Israel in the future. At the time that Lincoln said that, he did not call for equal rights for enslaved people. In fact, he called for them to be sent back to Africa. And he justified his position on the basis that slavery encouraged miscegenation. Too many mulattoes. The country was not ready to hear anything about equal rights. Only decades and decades after the Civil War did we see that what was really at stake, since the blacks and enslaved people were not going to go back to Africa, was whether the country was going to be all free or all slave, all Jim Crow or all equal. And we're still struggling with that, but we have a multiracial democracy that Lincoln never described, if he happened to imagine it. I don't know. So that's what I'm looking at in Israel now. It's a country that is on the road, a long and winding road, to a multinational democracy. But that doesn't come easily.
John?
Yeah, I was wondering if we could shift our discussion a little bit from what's going on within Israel's borders to Israel's place in the Middle East and in global politics. Of course, Israel is the only nuclear power in the Middle East, and in a larger context, it is now having to deal with China. China, just in our last show, we talked about China brokering the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We know, of course, that there has always been the prospects of Israel starting a disaster, what I believe would be a disastrous war with Iran. I was wondering what Professor Lustick's thoughts are about Israel's foreign relations as things are quickly changing now in the context of the Ukrainian war, Russia's aggression in the Ukraine, and now Russia jumping into the mix. Russia and China.
It's just a huge question you're asking.
And we only have 10 minutes.
I mean, it's very difficult. And one of the difficulties is that the correct answer to many of those questions is so unfamiliar to your listeners that it would be somewhat shocking to hear.
Well, I want to tell you, Professor, that we send our show, so our show doesn't just go to the broadcast area here in Northern California. We package our show as podcasts. We package our shows for YouTube, and we send our show to many key members in Congress and to the State Department and to intelligence agencies. I'm a frequent guest at the Council on Foreign Relations, and we get our show out to a lot of the decision makers out there. So you're speaking to them as well.
Okay. Well, let me just focus on the time that I have on the Iran side of what you're asking. And unfortunately, it is not separated from Israeli domestic politics. As you know, most of American foreign policy decisions are driven in large part by what they require or what influences are brought to bear because of domestic political concerns. So in Israel, you have a fundamental problem. The right has a fundamental problem. It has no vision of the future that it can offer, that it can say, you Arabs, you Palestinians should be happy with this. They can say that to governments of Saudi Arabia, of the United Arab Emirates, of Morocco, because those governments, Egypt, are autocratic. They have their own autocratic interests in aid from the United States, protection from the United States, protection from Israel, security services, intelligence, legitimization. but the masses of people who live there, Israel is not offering them anything. Knowing that, Israel requires that its Air Force especially be able to operate without any cost, whether it's in Syria or in Gaza or Lebanon. Since you have no real peace negotiations on the table, you have to be able to use force at will with low cost. That way, nobody asks you questions about why you're not bringing peace. The Iranian ability to move toward nuclear weapons, which I believe they didn't originally want to do, but now they definitely are doing, the fundamental threat is not that they will attack Israel. Security experts in Israel, no one really believes that. And Netanyahu himself kind of shows it's untrue, because it's been 30 years since he's been saying it's 1938. And Iran is Nazi Germany within 2 years, within 3 years, et cetera, et cetera. What the real problem is that if Iran is a powerful country and has the capacity to maybe produce even one nuclear weapon quickly, then any use of the Air Force by Israel in Syria or against Iranian forces in Lebanon or else might escalate. If it might escalate, that means all of a sudden the use of force is not costless. It forces Israeli politicians to actually answer questions. So what if we can't rely on our weaponry all the time? What is our long-term goal? And that's not something that the right in Israel ever wants to talk about. Now, Israel has no intention of attacking Iran. They are much more interested in the world fearing that they might attack Iran. If they were really interested in attacking Iran, or if they were really afraid of Iran, they would be rushing to get a nuclear weapon. Of course, they already have nuclear weapons, so they're not threatening to get a nuclear weapon because they already have them. And the whole reason they have them is to deter a country like Iran. They never were worried about that. What they want is alienation between the United States and Iran. And the best way to do that is to go into Congress and convince Congress you've got to impose massive sanctions on Iran. Don't have negotiations with that country. Don't ally with its moderate elements, because that will deny Israel it will put Israel into a more difficult regional situation than it would if Iran is utterly isolated. Israel wants the hegemony in the area. It does not want competitors. So that's, and most American decision makers, they understand this. Whether they can say publicly what they think is another question.
We have about 4 minutes, Dr. Lustick, and I wonder if there's some area that we did not speak about that you feel you would like to impart to our listeners, and also how they might, the B part of that is how they might read some of your articles and writings and follow your work.
Okay, well, so if there's a website, paradigmlostbook.com, and on that site I publish articles that are appearing by me and by others that illuminate the current situation, and I think would be useful for folks to follow. Certainly they can get all my interviews and my own articles. I think the most interesting and a little subtle point that I would like to explain in these last minutes is the predicament that centrist Israelis have. So often you hear in meetings, in the New York Times published an editorial the other day. The two-state solution is all but moribund. It's effectively moribund. I made a collection in my book of ways people have said it's dead, but not dead. Over 20 years, it is dead. But what you find is many centrists in Israel, or even leftists, will say we cannot stop talking about the two-state solution, even though it's unavailable. We have to keep acting as if it's available, because if we don't, we'll be faced with a choice between of democracy or apartheid, a real choice. And we don't want to make that choice. So if we say that the situation is temporary and someday the West Bank and Gaza Arabs will have their own state, then we don't have to face that question. So I don't care whether it really is impossible. We still have to raise money and talk about it as if it is possible. I understand that. That's a political ploy. What I want people to do is to say, wow, you mean to say that I'm helping to keep oppression in place by talking about the two-state solution now? It used to be that was a liberationist position. Mm-hmm. Now it is not. It is camouflaging something worse than apartheid, because if apartheid is implemented, you have a public target, an admitted target, something that most people can't even accept. But if you say, we're just waiting for the right time to restart negotiations when you know that will never occur, you're talking about a much more insidious and effective form of subordination and ultimately producing anomic violence of the sort that Palestinians are now engaging in. Generation of people who are just so frustrated and so furious that even in an unorganized way, they will lash out with violence in any way they can against their oppressors.
We've been speaking with Dr. Ian Lustick, and the article in the book that he references, What America's Civil War Can Teach Us About Israel, which he alluded to, and then the book Paradigm Lost. Please, if you're interested in this, and we all should be, please check those out and do what you can. Thank you, Dr. Lustick.
Yes.
This has been really informative and exciting and disturbing and all of those above.
Oh, and I want to thank you so much, Professor, for being on the show. You make me want to be 20 years old again and one of your doctoral candidates.
Really?
If I had three wishes, that would be one of them.
Thank you, John. And take care, everyone. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And thanks again for being with us.